The grand chamber of the galactic Concord was carved from the heart of a living crystal moon, and on this particular morning, it hummed with the voices of 312 civilizations, each one older, larger, and more powerful than the small blue world that sat quietly in the highest and smallest balcony at the very back of the room. Ambassador Lena Vasquez stood at the railing of that balcony with her hands folded behind her back and her face perfectly still, the way it always was when she was listening to someone try to break her. She had been a crisis negotiator for the United Nations before First Contact changed everything, and in those years she had learned one simple truth. The person who speaks first in anger is the person who has already lost. Behind her sat the rest of Earth's delegation, 6 people in total, which was almost embarrassing when you looked at the Drailith hegemony section across the chamber, where over 200 advisors and legal scholars filled an entire wing, draped in banners of deep crimson and black. Junior attaché Rio Tanaka sat in the second row with a datapad on his knee, and a jaw clenched so tight that the muscles in his neck had turned to cords. Beside him, Dr. Adiz Okonkwo, the astrophysicist assigned to the delegation for navigational consultations, was gripping the armrest of her chair hard enough to leave marks in the alien wood. The reason for their tension stood 30 meters below on the central dais of the chamber. Voreth Kale, High Speaker of the Drailith hegemony, a being who stood nearly 3 meters tall with scales the color of dried blood, and a voice that did not simply fill a room but shook it down to the foundations. Voreth had been speaking for almost an hour now. He had begun by formally announcing the Drailith hegemony's decision to deny Earth's petition for passage rights through the Valen corridor, which was the single most important hyperspace route connecting the outer spiral to the wealthy core systems, and the only route Earth's young colony ships could use to reach the resources they desperately needed to survive as a spacefaring civilization. But the denial itself had taken only a few minutes. The rest of the hour was something else entirely. Voreth Kale was not just rejecting Earth's petition. He was performing the rejection like a show, turning it into entertainment for the assembled species of the conquered. He held up a copy of Earth's petition, a 40-page document that Lena and her team had spent 5 months drafting with painstaking care, and he read sections of it aloud in a mocking tone that his translator rendered with cruel precision. The petitioning species requests consideration, Voreth read, and the infrasonic undertone of his voice made the crystal walls vibrate, based on principles of mutual benefit and shared prosperity. He paused and looked up at the chamber with the slow theatrical gaze of a predator who knew every eye was on him. Shared prosperity. From a species that has been among the stars for 11 cycles. A species whose entire fleet would fit inside one of our patrol hangars. A species that still measures time by the rotation of their own little rock. Laughter rolled through the chamber, not from everyone, but from enough. The Drailith allies laughed loudly and openly. The trade-dependent neutrals laughed nervously because they knew the cost of silence, and even a few species who might have felt sympathy chose to smile rather than risk standing apart from the crowd. Voreth continued, page by page, pulling apart every carefully chosen word the human delegation had written and holding it up to ridicule. He mocked their understanding of galactic trade law, their naive belief that a species so young could simply ask for what older civilizations had spent millennia earning, and most of all he mocked their ambition, the absurd, laughable idea that humans belonged anywhere near the core systems. They have 200 ships, Voreth announced with a sweeping gesture toward the human balcony, and Lena could feel the weight of 1,000 alien eyes turning upward toward her. 200. I have more ships guarding a single mining outpost in the Valen belt, and these creatures dare to petition for passage as though they are our equals. More laughter, louder now, and Rio Tanaka shifted in his seat with a movement that Lena recognized. It was the coiling motion of a young man about to do something brave and very stupid. Without turning around, she reached back and placed one hand on his shoulder, a touch so light it barely made contact, but it was enough, and he went still. Vorath spoke for another 20 minutes after that, detailing every weakness and shortcoming of humanity with the thoroughness of someone who had clearly prepared for this moment and intended to savor every second of it. He talked about human lifespans, so tragically short that a Drailith child would outlive 3 generations of human diplomats. He talked about human biology, their soft skin, their need for constant hydration, their bizarre dependence on a liquid stimulant they called coffee. And he talked about their history, a species that had spent most of its existence fighting itself over patches of dirt on a single continent, before stumbling into space almost by accident. The chamber listened, and the chamber laughed, and Lena Vasquez stood motionless through every single word, her expression as still and unreadable as stone. When Vorath finally finished, he turned his massive head directly toward the human balcony, and the chamber fell into a hush that was almost sacred in its completeness. The silence of 300 civilizations waiting to see how the youngest and smallest among them would respond to being torn apart in front of the entire galaxy. Vorath spoke his final words in the old Drailith tongue, and the translator AI rendered them with cold fidelity. Go home and try again in 1,000 cycles, little mammals. Perhaps by then you will understand how civilizations speak. The silence that followed was absolute. Lena looked down at Vorath Kale across 30 meters of crystal air, and for a long moment the two of them simply existed in the same stillness. The ancient reptilian lord who controlled the most important corridor in the galaxy, and the human woman who controlled nothing at all, except the 6 exhausted people sitting behind her. Then Lena stepped forward to the microphone at the edge of her balcony. The sound system carried her voice to every corner of the grand chamber, and though she did not raise it even slightly, it reached places that Vorath's infrasonic rumble could not. It reached the quiet corners where delegates were already composing messages to their home worlds, and it reached the press galleries where journalists from 100 species leaned forward in their seats, and it reached the ears of Vorath Kale himself, who for the first time in the entire session looked directly at a human being, as though she might actually be worth listening to. Lena said 5 words. "We will return by morning." For a single heartbeat the chamber was silent, and then the laughter came, harder and louder than anything before, because every species in the room knew that a full conquered treaty had never been completed in less than 8 cycles, and most took 50 or more. And the idea that these short-lived, soft-skinned, caffeine-dependent little primates could produce anything of substance in a single night was the funniest thing the galactic conquered had heard in 1,000 years. Lena did not wait for the laughter to stop. She turned from the microphone, walked past her delegation without a word, and headed for the exit. One by one her team rose and followed, Rio still trembling with anger, Dr. Okonkwo already running calculations behind her eyes, and the rest of them moving with the quiet, coordinated urgency of people who had just been given an impossible deadline and had already decided to meet it. As they passed through the great doors of the chamber, Rio leaned close to Lena and whispered, "Ambassador, do we actually have a plan?" Lena kept walking, her heels clicking against the crystal floor in a rhythm that sounded almost like a countdown. "We have something better than a plan," she said without slowing down. "We have 8 billion people who just got told they are not good enough, and Rio, you have never seen what happens when you tell a human they cannot do something." The doors closed behind them, and the laughter of the galactic conquered echoed off the crystal walls of an empty balcony, where 6 chairs still held the warmth of the people who had just decided to change everything. The human delegation's quarters occupied a small suite of rooms in the Concord's diplomatic ring. 4 rooms total, barely enough space for 6 people and their equipment. Tucked between a maintenance corridor and the quarters of a fungal species that communicated through spores and smelled like wet earth after a storm. Lena Vasquez walked through the door, pulled off her diplomatic jacket, threw it over a chair, and said 3 words to her team. "Wake up, Earth." Ryo Tanaka was already moving. He powered on the quantum link transmitter that sat in the corner of their main room, a device the size of a refrigerator that could connect them to any point on Earth's communication network with zero delay regardless of the distance. And within 90 seconds the screen was alive with faces. The first face belonged to Secretary General Miriam Ademi, who was sitting in her office in Geneva with a cup of tea that she set down very carefully when Lena told her what had happened in the chamber and what she intended to do about it. The second face belonged to Director Huang Wei of the World Legal Consortium, a body of 6,000 international lawyers that had been formed specifically to handle Earth's integration into galactic law, and had been waiting for exactly this kind of crisis since the day it was founded. The third face belonged to General Catherine Morales of DARPA's Exostrategy Division, a think tank that had spent a decade wargaming every possible scenario for galactic diplomacy, including several that involved exactly this kind of confrontation with the Drailith. Within 20 minutes, Lena was in simultaneous contact with 14 national heads of state, the full leadership of the World Legal Consortium, the Terran Astrophysical Navigation Authority, 3 of Earth's largest universities, and the operations team managing ARIA, Earth's most advanced artificial intelligence, a system that had been specifically trained on every treaty, every accord, every legal document, and every diplomatic record in both human and galactic history. Lena gave the order and her voice carried across 200 light-years of space with perfect clarity. We are drafting a full Veylan Passage Treaty. It must be legally perfect under conquered law. It must be diplomatically attractive to at least 200 member species, and it must be finished and in my hands in 14 hours. On Earth, the reaction was instant and electric. In Sao Paulo, a team of 40 trade lawyers canceled everything on their calendars and began pulling apart every commercial treaty the conquered had ever ratified, looking for patterns and precedents and loopholes that could be turned into tools. In Tokyo, a group of economic analysts started building models to calculate the exact financial impact of Drailith toll practices on every single member species in the conquered. In Geneva, the World Legal Consortium activated its full emergency protocol for the first time in its history and divided its 6,000 lawyers into specialized teams, one for corridor law, one for sovereignty disputes, one for economic provisions, one for enforcement mechanisms, and one whose only job was to attack their own work and find weaknesses before anyone else could. ARIA processed the entire body of galactic conquered treaty law in the first hour, over 900 million pages of legal text spanning 40,000 years of interstellar diplomacy, and began flagging every relevant precedent, every overlooked provision, and every forgotten clause that could serve humanity's purpose. Dr. Adiz Okonkwo sat in the corner of the delegation's quarters with a holographic display floating in front of her face and her fingers moving through equations at a speed that made Rio dizzy just watching. She was not a lawyer, and she was not a diplomat, but she was possibly the most brilliant astrophysicist of her generation. And Lena had learned long ago that brilliant people find ways to be useful in a crisis, even when the crisis has nothing to do with their field. At the 3-hour mark, Okonkwo made the discovery that changed everything. She had been reading through the oldest sections of conquered law, documents so ancient that most species had forgotten they existed, when ARIA flagged an obscure provision buried in the founding charter of the conquered itself. It was called the Doctrine of Emergent Necessity. It was 12,000 cycles old, and it stated in language that was remarkably clear for something so ancient that any species facing existential stagnation due to monopolistic corridor control had the legal right to invoke a claim of universal passage, but only if they could prove that the corridor-controlling species had denied access without offering any reasonable alternative. Okonkwo read it twice, then 3 times, then called Lena over and showed her. The Drailith had controlled the Veylan Passage for 6,000 cycles, and in all that time They had never once offered an alternative to any species they denied. They simply said no and dared anyone to challenge them, and no one ever had, because no one had ever looked this deep into laws this old. But Arya had looked, because humans had built Arya to look at everything, and because humans had a peculiar habit of reading the fine print. Lena stared at the text on the display, and for the first time since leaving the grand chamber she allowed herself to smile. Not a large smile, not a triumphant one, just the small quiet expression of a woman who had found the key to a door that everyone else had forgotten existed. The treaty draft began to take shape in waves after that, with teams on Earth writing sections in parallel and sending them through the quantum link for assembly. The legal teams wrote the framework, the economists filled in the financial projections, the diplomats crafted language that was precise enough to survive legal challenge but elegant enough to inspire support. And Arya reviewed every word against the full body of conquered precedent to ensure that not a single clause could be attacked. Director Huang Wei coordinated the legal teams with the calm efficiency of a conductor leading an orchestra through its most difficult symphony. Whenever a section was completed, he sent it to the attack team, who tried to tear it apart, and when they found weaknesses, those weaknesses were repaired within minutes, and the section was sent back through again, until it was unbreakable. The key strategic decision, the one that would make the treaty succeed where a simple petition had failed, came from Secretary General Adami herself during a call at the 5-hour mark. "Do not make this about Earth," she told Lena, and her voice carried the weight of someone who had spent 30 years in diplomacy and understood power at its most fundamental level. "Make this about the conquered, make it a gift, not a demand. Show every species in that chamber how much the Drailith monopoly has cost them, and then offer them something better." So that is what they did. The treaty was reframed not as Earth's plea for access, but as a comprehensive reform of passage law that would benefit the entire galaxy. It calculated the economic losses that Drailith tolls imposed on each of the 312 member species, and it showed in precise detail how universal passage reform would save the conquered an estimated 1.7 trillion galactic standard units per cycle in trade inefficiency. At the 9-hour mark, Secretary General Adami called again, this time to say that she had personally reviewed the latest draft, and that it was, in her exact words, the most aggressive piece of legal architecture I have ever seen in my life. And she said it the way a general might compliment a perfectly executed battle plan. At the 12-hour mark, Ryo Tanaka began the next phase of the operation. Using secure diplomatic channels, he transmitted advance copies of the treaty to 3 carefully chosen delegations. The Thessari Republic, who were ancient rivals of the Drailith and would relish any opportunity to weaken their influence. The Ilvari Syndicate, who held the record for the fastest treaty in conquered history, and who respected speed and audacity above all other virtues. And the Morvathi Collective, a quiet and patient species who had been paying Drailith tolls for longer than humanity had existed, and who had been waiting for exactly this kind of moment without ever knowing it. Ryo's message to each delegation was identical and deliberately simple. "Please review the attached document before the morning session. We believe you will find it interesting." At the 14-hour mark, the treaty was complete. It was 4,200 pages long. It cited 11,000 legal precedents spanning the full 40,000 cycle history of the galactic conquered. It included economic projections for all 312 member species. It had been reviewed by Arya against every known form of conquered legal challenge, and found to be flawless, not merely adequate, not merely competent, but airtight in a way that most galactic legal scholars would have said was impossible for a document produced in anything less than a decade. Lena held the data crystal in her hand, a small object barely larger than her thumb that contained the work of 8 billion minds compressed into a single night, and she looked at her team. Ryo had dark circles under his eyes so deep they looked like bruises. Dr. Okonkwo had residue from the holographic equations on her fingers and in her hair. The rest of the team sat slumped in their chairs with the hollow, wide-eyed look of people who had pushed past exhaustion into something beyond it, something that burned clean and bright and refused to let them stop. On Earth, the sun was rising over Geneva and Sao Paulo and Tokyo, and in each of those cities, thousands of lawyers and analysts and scientists and strategists were leaning back from their desks, with the stunned realization that they had just done something that no civilization in the history of the galaxy had ever done before. Lena looked at her team and said, "Let us go make history." And then she put on her diplomatic jacket, picked up the data crystal, and walked toward the door, because in 14 hours the youngest species in the galactic Concord had produced a treaty that should have taken 50 years. And the only thing left to do was deliver it to a chamber full of people who were expecting them to fail. The grand chamber was more crowded than it had been in living memory, and the reason was simple. Word had spread through every corridor and quarter and embassy of the diplomatic ring that the humans had promised to return by morning, and nearly every species in the Concord had sent someone to watch what they assumed would be the most entertaining failure in galactic history. The Thessari delegation occupied their gallery in disciplined silence, their silver-skinned faces betraying nothing to anyone who did not know how to read the subtle shifts in their bioluminescent markings. The Ilvari sat in their section, with the focused attention of predators watching prey approach a trap. The Morvathi, a species of immense slow-moving beings who resembled living stone, had sent their full delegation for the first time in over 100 cycles, a detail that only the most observant members of the chamber noticed, and that none of them could explain. Voreth Kale was already seated in the Drailith gallery, his massive frame settled into his chair with the relaxed confidence of someone who had already won. His aides had prepared 3 separate documents for the morning. One for a formal statement of disappointment when the humans failed to appear, one for a motion to reduce Earth's observer privileges as punishment for wasting the Council's time, and one for a speech about the importance of knowing one's place in the galactic order. He did not prepare a 4th document for the possibility that the humans might actually have something worth presenting, because in 6,000 cycles of Drailith, diplomatic dominance, that possibility had never once been worth considering. The Earth delegation entered the chamber at exactly the scheduled time. They looked terrible. Ambassador Lena Vasquez had shadows under her eyes that her diplomatic composure could not entirely hide, and her usually immaculate suit was slightly creased at the sleeves in a way that suggested she had rolled them up at some point during the night, and only recently rolled them back down. Behind her Rio, Tanaka carried 4 data crystals in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other, with the grip of a man who would defend both with his life. Dr. Okonkwo walked with the slightly unsteady gait of someone who had been sitting in front of a holographic display for 14 hours straight, and had not yet fully remembered how legs worked. A murmur passed through the chamber as the humans took their seats in the small balcony at the top of the room, the same balcony that had been the site of their humiliation less than a day ago. And for a moment the murmur carried the edge of amusement, because surely these exhausted, sleep-deprived creatures could not possibly have anything serious to present. Then Lena Vasquez stepped to the microphone. She did not begin with a greeting or a preamble or any of the elaborate formal rituals that most species used when addressing the council. She simply began to speak, and her voice, quiet and steady and absolutely certain, cut through the noise of the chamber like a blade through silk. "Honored delegates of the Galactic Concord," she said, "last evening the Drailith hegemony denied Earth's petition for passage through the Valen corridor and suggested that we return in 1,000 cycles when we might better understand how civilizations speak. I am here to inform the Council that we have used the intervening hours to prepare a response, and I respectfully request permission to present it now." Permission was granted. It was a formality, since any observer species had the right to address the chamber, and Lena activated the data crystal. The holographic displays that lined the chamber walls came alive with light and color and information, and what they showed was not a revised petition or a diplomatic appeal or any of the modest submissions that the Council expected from a species of Earth standing. What they showed was a complete treaty, 4,200 pages of legal architecture so dense and so comprehensive that several delegates in the chamber physically leaned forward in their seats as though drawn by gravity. Lena walked the Council through it with the calm precision of a surgeon explaining an operation. She began with the legal foundation, the doctrine of emergent necessity, a provision written into the founding charter of the Concord itself 12,000 cycles ago, which established the right of universal passage for any species facing existential stagnation due to monopolistic corridor control. A ripple of shock moved through the elder delegations when they heard the name of the doctrine. Some of them recognized it instantly, because their ancestors had helped write it during the earliest days of the Concord, when the principles of open passage were considered sacred. They had simply forgotten, over 12 millennia of accumulated bureaucracy and shifting power, that the word still existed and still carried the force of law. Voreth Kale did not recognize the doctrine, and the sudden stillness of his aides told Lena everything she needed to know about how seriously the Drailith had taken the possibility that anyone would ever challenge their monopoly on legal grounds this fundamental. Lena continued. She presented the economic analysis, detailed projections showing how the Drailith toll system on the Valen Passage cost the Concord an estimated 1.7 trillion galactic standard units per cycle in trade inefficiency, with losses distributed across 280 of the 312 member species. She named them. One by one, she named the species that were losing wealth to the Drailith toll system, and for each one she showed the exact figure, how much they paid, how much they lost in delayed shipments and rerouted trade and missed economic opportunities. And the numbers were not abstract or theoretical. They were precise and specific and devastating in their clarity, because Arya had calculated them using the Concord's own trade data, and there was no way to dispute them without disputing the Concord's own records. Then Lena did the thing that transformed the treaty from a legal document into a political masterpiece. She did not ask the Council to grant Earth passage through the Valen corridor. She asked the Council to reform the entire system of corridor passage for the benefit of every species in the Concord. The treaty proposed universal passage rights for all member species through all major hyperspace corridors, with standardized toll structures regulated by the Concord rather than controlled by individual species. It proposed an independent corridor authority to oversee maintenance and safety. It proposed economic transition support for species that currently depended on toll revenue. And it proposed all of this not as an attack on the Drailith, but as a modernization of galactic trade law that would make every member species wealthier and more connected. Earth would gain passage to the core systems, yes, but so would dozens of other species who had been quietly suffering under the current system for centuries and had never had the courage or the legal framework to challenge it. The Thessari delegate rose from her seat, the first to stand, and the bioluminescent patterns on her silver skin were flaring in a configuration that every species in the chamber recognized as profound respect. The Ilvari delegate stood next, and then the Morvathi, their massive stone-like bodies rising with a slowness that somehow made the gesture more powerful than any sudden movement could have been. And then more delegations rose, dozens of them, species that had read the advance copies Rio had sent and species that were hearing this for the first time, and were standing simply because the numbers on the holographic displays spoke for themselves. Voreth Kale surged to his feet, and his infrasonic voice hit the chamber like a physical force, shaking the crystal walls and silencing the rising murmur of support. "How is this possible?" he demanded, and for the first time since Lena had known him his voice carried something other than contempt. It carried confusion, genuine and raw, the confusion of a being who had held power for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be surprised. How can a species that has existed in this Concord for 11 cycles produce a treaty that my own scholars could not draft in decades? What trick is this? What deception? What? Lena let him finish. She waited until the echo of his voice had faded from the crystal walls, and the chamber had fallen into the kind of silence that happens when every being in a room understands that what comes next will be remembered for a very long time. Then she spoke, and her voice was not loud, but it filled the chamber in a way that Voreth's roar had not, because it was not trying to dominate the silence. It was simply occupying it, the way water fills a glass, completely and without effort. "High Speaker Voreth," she said, "you asked how this is possible. The answer is not a trick or a deception. The answer is that you gave us a night, and we only needed a night. Our world has 8 billion minds. And when you told us we were not ready, every single one of them disagreed." She paused and looked across the chamber at the hundreds of delegates who were still standing, their faces and bodies and bioluminescent patterns and pheromone signatures, all expressing variations of the same emotion. Astonishment. The pure and overwhelming astonishment of beings who were witnessing something that had no precedent in 40,000 years of galactic civilization. "This treaty is not Earth's gift to itself," Lena said. "It is Earth's gift to the conquered. We did not come here to take something from this galaxy. We came here to offer something. And what we offer is the willingness to work harder, move faster, and dream bigger than anyone expects. Because that is what humans do. It is what we have always done. And it is what we will continue to do for as long as you let us stand in this chamber." The applause, or what passed for applause among 312 different species, with 312 different ways of expressing approval, began slowly, and then built into something that shook the grand chamber harder than Voreth Kale's voice ever had. And in the small balcony at the top of the room, Rio Tanaka quietly unscrewed the cap of his thermos and took a sip of coffee, because some victories deserve to be celebrated with the things that made them possible. The council declared a recess after Lena's presentation, and the grand chamber emptied into the corridors of the diplomatic ring like water breaking through a dam. Hundreds of delegations pouring into hallways and meeting rooms and private quarters, every one of them talking about the same thing, the impossible thing, the thing the humans had done. But in the Drailith hegemony's wing of the diplomatic ring, an entire section of the station that was older and grander than anything the humans would ever be assigned, the mood was not one of awe or admiration, but of cold and mounting fury. Voreth Kale stood at the center of his war room surrounded by his senior advisors, and the infrasonic hum that radiated from his body was low enough to make the fixtures on the walls rattle. His scales had darkened from their usual dried blood crimson to something closer to black, which among the Drailith was a sign of rage, so deep it bordered on violence. His legal scholars had spent the first 2 hours of the recess combing through the human treaty line by line, searching for a flaw, a mistake, a single point of weakness they could use to have it dismissed, and they had found nothing. The treaty cited 11,000 legal precedents, and every single one of them was valid. The economic projections were built on the Concord's own publicly available trade data, and could not be challenged without the Drailith essentially admitting that the Concord's records were wrong. The doctrine of emergent necessity was not some obscure technicality that could be waved away. It was part of the founding charter itself, as fundamental to Concord law as gravity was to physics. Salith Mora sat in the back of the war room and watched the senior advisors deliver their report to the High Speaker, with the careful diplomatic language of people who knew that bringing bad news to Voreth Kale was one of the most dangerous jobs in the hegemony. Salith was the youngest legal attaché on the Drailith delegation, barely past her 2nd century, which made her practically an adolescent by her species standards, and she had been assigned to the delegation as a learning opportunity, a chance to observe galactic diplomacy at the highest level. What she was observing now was not diplomacy, but the slow collapse of a power structure that had been built on the assumption that no one would ever push back. She had run the numbers herself privately on her personal console in the quarters she shared with 3 other junior staffers. The human treaty was not just valid, it was brilliant, the kind of document that her people had stopped producing centuries ago because they had grown too comfortable in their monopoly to innovate, too secure in their power to imagine that innovation might ever be necessary. When the legal scholars finished their report, and the silence in the war room became thick enough to taste, Voreth Kale made his decision. He would not fight the treaty in the chamber. He would not engage with its legal arguments or dispute its economic projections or attempt to challenge the doctrine of emergent necessity on procedural grounds. All of those approaches would fail, and failure in the public forum of the Grand Chamber would be worse than anything the humans had already done to him. Instead, he would use the one weapon that no treaty could overcome, the weapon that had kept the Drailith in power for 6,000 cycles, and that had broken every challenge to their authority before this one. He announced to the Council through formal diplomatic channels that if the Treaty of Universal Passage reform was brought to a vote, the Drailith hegemony would exercise its sovereign right to close the Vaylun Passage entirely, not just to Earth, not just to the species that supported the treaty, but to everyone. A full economic blockade of the most important trade corridor in the galaxy. The effect was immediate and devastating. Within hours, the galactic markets shuddered as trading algorithms processed the implications of a closed Vaylun Passage. Supply chains that depended on the corridor began to freeze, commodity prices spiked, and the smaller species that relied on core system trade for their survival began to panic in ways that were visible even across the vast distances of the diplomatic ring. The coalition that had risen in support of the human treaty began to waver. The Thessari held firm because they had their own trade routes and could survive a closure, and the Ilvari held firm because their culture considered backing down from a challenge to be worse than economic ruin. But the dozens of smaller species that had stood in the Grand Chamber began to sit back down one by one, as the reality of what a closed passage would mean for their economies settled over them like a shadow. Lena received the news in the human quarters, and for the first time in the entire crisis, she allowed herself to sit down, not because she was defeated, but because she needed to think, and thinking required stillness. The Drailith Gambit was elegant in its brutality. It did not matter that the treaty was legally perfect if the species who needed to vote for it were too frightened of economic collapse to cast their votes. Voreth was betting that the coalition would break before the vote could be called, and based on the messages Rio was receiving from sympathetic delegations, that bet was looking increasingly likely to pay off. Lena opened a channel to Earth and briefed Secretary General Adami on the situation. Adami listened without interrupting, and when Lena finished, the Secretary General asked a single question. "What do you need?" "A miracle," Lena said. And she almost smiled when she said it because she knew that asking for miracles was the kind of thing that humans did reflexively, and that the universe had an odd habit of providing them, usually at the last possible moment, and usually from the most unexpected direction. The miracle came from Dr. Adiz Okonkwo. She had been sitting in her corner of the quarters throughout the crisis, working on her holographic display with the intense focus of someone who was not entirely present in the same room as everyone else. Rio had brought her coffee 3 times, and she had not touched any of them. And when she finally looked up from her equations, her eyes had the slightly unfocused quality of a person returning from a very long journey to a very distant place. "Ambassador," she said, and something in her voice made everyone in the room stop what they were doing and turn toward her. "I need to show you something. I have been working on this for 3 years, and I was not sure it was ready, but I am sure now." She projected her holographic display into the center of the room, and what appeared was a 3-dimensional map of hyperspace. The invisible web of corridors and channels that connected the stars and made faster-than-light travel possible. The Valen passage was marked in red, a thick bright line cutting through the map like an artery. Beside it, almost parallel but slightly offset, was a second line that Okonkwo had marked in blue, thinner, rougher, less defined, but unmistakably real. "This is what I call the Okonkwo corridor," she said, and the name carried no ego but simply the quiet certainty of a scientist who had discovered something true. "It is a secondary hyperspace channel that runs parallel to the Valen passage. It is narrower, more turbulent, and its navigational parameters are significantly more complex than the passage itself. Most galactic navigational systems cannot handle the calculations required to transit it safely." She paused and looked at Lena. "But our systems can." The room went very quiet. "Human navigational technology," Okonkwo continued, "was developed by a species that learned to cross oceans by reading the stars from the deck of a wooden ship in the middle of a storm. Our systems are designed for chaos, for turbulence, for the kind of complex variable calculations that other species' navigation computers were never built to handle. I have run the simulations 412 times, and the success rate for human navigational systems transiting the Okonkwo corridor is 97.8%. Lena stared at the blue line on the map, and she understood immediately. Not just what Okonkwo had found, but what it meant in the context of the crisis unfolding around them. If the Drailith closed the Valen passage, Earth could open a new corridor, and more importantly, Earth could share that corridor with every species in the Conquered, freely, with no tolls, no inspections, and no Drailith oversight. The Drailith's threat to close the passage was only effective if closure meant that everyone suffered. If there was an alternative route, then closing the passage would not hurt the Conquered. It would only hurt the Drailith themselves, because all the toll revenue they collected from the passage would evaporate overnight as traffic shifted to a corridor they did not control. Lena made the decision in less than 30 seconds. "Rio," she said, "transmit the bypass data to every delegation in the Conquered, not as a threat, not as a warning, as an offer. Tell them that if the Valen passage closes, the Okonkwo corridor will open, and it will be free for all." Rio transmitted the data within the hour, and the effect was like watching a fire run backward. The panic that had been spreading through the Conquered reversed direction and flowed straight toward the Drailith delegation as every species in the galaxy realized at the same moment that the humans had not just neutralized the Drailith's only weapon, but had turned it into a weapon against them. In the Drailith war room, Salith Mora received the bypass data on her personal console. She checked the navigational calculations twice, then a third time, and then she stood up and walked to the center of the room where Voreth Kale sat surrounded by advisors who were all reading the same data with expressions that ranged from disbelief to something very close to fear. "High Speaker," Salith said, and her voice was steady even though she knew that what she was about to say could end her career or possibly her life. "The humans have found an alternative corridor. The data is sound, and I have verified it independently. If we close the passage, we will lose all toll revenue permanently, and the Conquered will simply route through the new corridor without us. I strongly recommend immediate negotiation." Voreth looked at her with eyes that burned like embers in the dark hollows of his skull, and for a long moment the war room was so silent that Salith could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. "Get out," Voreth said. Salith turned and walked out of the war room. She walked past the senior advisors and the military attachés and the ancient banners of crimson and black, and she kept walking until she reached the corridor outside the Drailith wing. And then she kept walking farther, past the maintenance corridors and the spore-scented quarters of the fungal species, until she reached a small door with a small sign that read Earth Diplomatic Mission. She knocked. Rio Tanaka opened the door and looked at the Drailith woman standing in the corridor, young by her species standards, her scales a muted shade of copper rather than the deep crimson of the senior officials, and her eyes carrying the expression of someone who had just made the hardest decision of her life and was already at peace with it. "My name is Salith Mora," she said, "and I believe we can help each other." Lena appeared behind Rio in the doorway and studied Salith for exactly 3 seconds, which was all the time a career crisis negotiator needed to determine whether someone standing in front of her was trustworthy. "Come in," Lena said, and she stepped aside to let the first Drailith who had ever entered a human diplomatic mission walk through the door and into a room full of people who had not slept in 30 hours and were about to change the galaxy again. 72 hours had passed since Lena Vasquez had spoken 5 quiet words into the microphone of the smallest balcony in the Grand Chamber, and in that time, the youngest species in the galactic Concord had produced a flawless treaty, survived an economic blockade threat, discovered an alternative hyperspace corridor, and fractured the oldest power monopoly in the galaxy. And now, as the morning of the 3rd day arrived, it was time to finish what they had started. The Grand Chamber was full in a way it had not been full in over 1,000 cycles. Every seat in every gallery was occupied, and species that had not sent representatives to the Concord in centuries had dispatched emergency delegations to be present for what everyone understood would be a historic vote. The holographic feeds broadcasting from the chamber were being watched on every inhabited world in the galaxy, and for the first time in its long history, the galactic Concord felt less like a bureaucracy and more like a living thing holding its breath. Salith Mora had spent the past 48 hours in the human quarters, sleeping on a borrowed cot and sharing meals with people who ate bizarre soft foods and drank an alarming amount of coffee. And in that time, she had provided Lena with something more valuable than any treaty or navigational data. She had provided intelligence about the internal politics of the Drailith hegemony. The picture she painted was one of fracture. Voreth Kale and his hardliners controlled the military and the passage itself, but the merchant clans, the families that had built their wealth on trade flowing through the Veylan corridor, saw the writing on the wall with devastating clarity. The Okonkwo corridor meant that the Drailith monopoly was over regardless of how the vote went, because even if the treaty failed, the humans would simply open the new corridor, and the trade would shift, and the toll revenue would disappear, and 6,000 cycles of economic dominance would end not with a battle, but with a balance sheet. The younger generation of Drailith, Salith's generation, understood this better than anyone. They had grown up watching their elders rest on the comfortable cushion of guaranteed income and unchallenged power, and they had seen how that comfort had slowly eroded the innovation and ambition that had made the Drailith a great civilization in the first place. "The smart move," Salith told Lena during their final briefing before the vote, "is to negotiate now, while you still have something to gain by including us rather than going around us. Voreth will not see this because his pride will not let him, but the merchant clans will see it and the younger delegates will see it, and if you give them a reason to break with the hardliners, they will break." Lena listened, and then she did something that surprised Salith and surprised her own team, and would ultimately surprise the entire galactic Concord. She amended the treaty. Not to weaken it, not to remove the provisions for universal passage reform, but to add new sections that specifically protected Drailith economic interests during the transition. She proposed reduced tolls on the Veylan passage rather than eliminated ones, phased in over a 10-cycle period that would give the Drailith time to restructure their economy. She proposed guaranteed Drailith representation on the new corridor authority that would oversee both the Veylan passage and the Okonkwo corridor. And she proposed a technology-sharing agreement that would give the Drailith access to human navigational systems so they could transit the new corridor themselves. Rio looked at the amendments and then looked at Lena with an expression that was equal parts confusion and something close to admiration. "Ambassador," he said carefully, "they humiliated us in front of the entire galaxy. They tried to destroy the coalition with a blockade threat, And now you want to protect their economy." Lena looked at him with eyes that were tired and kind, and absolutely certain. "Rio," she said, "we did not come here to destroy the Drailith. We came here to join the galaxy, and the galaxy is better with them in it than out of it. If we crush them today, we make an enemy that will hate us for 1,000 cycles. But if we lift them up, we make a partner that will remember what we did when we had every reason not to do it." The morning session began, and Lena walked to the microphone for what she knew would be the last time in this particular fight. The chamber was so quiet that she could hear the faint crystalline hum of the moon itself resonating through the walls, as though the ancient structure was listening along with everyone else. She presented the amended treaty, the full version, including the new provisions for the Drailith, and she walked the chamber through the changes with the same calm precision she had used 2 days ago when she first unveiled the document. She explained the transition timeline, the reduced toll structure, the representation on the corridor authority, and the technology sharing agreement. Then she addressed Voreth Kale directly. "High Speaker," she said, and her voice carried across the chamber with a clarity that needed no infrasonic resonance to be felt. "2 days ago, you told us to go home and return in 1,000 cycles. We did not go home. We stayed and we worked and we built something that we believe can make this Concord stronger, not just for Earth but for every species in this chamber, including yours." She paused and let the words settle. "We are not offering this treaty as a weapon against the Drailith hegemony. We are offering it as a bridge. Your people built the Valen Passage into the most important trade route in the galaxy, and that achievement deserves to be honored, not destroyed. These amendments ensure that the Drailith remain a vital part of galactic commerce, not as monopolists but as partners, and we believe that partnership will make you stronger than any monopoly ever could." The vote was called. The delegations cast their decisions through the Concord's ancient voting system, each species transmitting a single signal, yes or no, through crystal relays that carried the vote to the central dais, where the results materialized as light in the air. The count appeared in holographic numerals above the dais, growing with each vote, and as the numbers climbed, the chamber began to react. Murmurs became voices and voices became something louder, something that built and built as the scale of what was happening became undeniable. The final count hung in the air like a second sun, 294 in favor, 11 against, 7 abstentions. It was the most lopsided treaty vote in the history of the Galactic Concord. The chamber erupted, not with the mocking laughter that had filled it 3 days ago, but with something else entirely. Something that transcended the 312 different ways that 312 different species expressed amazement and joy, and the sudden overwhelming realization that the galaxy had just changed in a way that could not be unchanged. Voreth Kale had voted against the treaty, his 11 allies had voted with him, and 7 nervous neutrals had abstained. But the rest of the galaxy, the vast overwhelming majority of the Concord, had looked at what the humans had built and had decided that the future was worth more than the past. In the aftermath of the vote, as delegations streamed from their galleries to congratulate the human team and to begin the work of implementation, something happened that only a few people witnessed, but that would be talked about in diplomatic circles for generations. Voreth Kale remained in his seat after his delegation had filed out. He sat alone in the great Drailith gallery with its crimson banners and its ancient symbols of power, and he looked across the chamber at the small balcony, where Lena Vasquez stood surrounded by her team and by Salith Mora, and by delegates from dozens of species who wanted to shake the hand of the woman who had done the impossible. And Voreth inclined his head. It was not a bow, and it was not a gesture of submission. It was smaller than that and larger than that at the same time. It was the acknowledgement of one leader to another, the recognition that he had been beaten not by tricks or deception, but by something he had not believed existed. A species that could take humiliation and transform it into fuel, that could take an impossible deadline and meet it with room to spare, and that could win a total victory and then choose mercy instead of dominance. Drailith saw it. She was standing beside Rio near the railing of the human balcony, and she saw her high speaker incline his head toward the human ambassador, and she understood in that moment that the Drailith hegemony would survive this. Not as the unchallenged power it had been, but as something new, something that might eventually be stronger for having been forced to change. 6 months later, the Okonkwo corridor was officially charted and opened to galactic traffic. Earth's colony ships made their first transit to the core systems, and the resources they found there would fuel humanity's expansion for centuries. The Vaylon Passage remained open under the new reduced toll structure, and the Drailith, adapting faster than anyone had expected, repositioned themselves as the primary maintenance and security contractors for both corridors, transforming their old monopoly into a new and more sustainable enterprise that earned them respect rather than resentment. Rio Tanaka was promoted to senior diplomatic attaché and given an office that was slightly larger than a closet, which he considered a tremendous improvement. Dr. Adiz Okonkwo received the Concord's highest scientific honor, the Vaylon Prize for Navigational Achievement, becoming the first human ever to receive it, and she displayed it on her desk next to a cold cup of coffee that she claimed was the same one Rio had brought her on the night of the treaty, and that she kept as a reminder of what was possible when you forgot to sleep. Drailith Mora accepted a position as the first Drailith liaison to Earth's diplomatic corps, and when a journalist asked her why she had left her own delegation to help the humans, she answered without hesitation, "I did not leave my people. I walked toward the future and brought my people with me. The humans taught me that adaptation is not weakness. It is the oldest form of strength." And Lena Vasquez returned to her small balcony in the grand chamber, the same balcony at the top of the room, the one farthest from the central dais, the one traditionally reserved for species still proving their worth. Several senior delegates offered to have Earth reassigned to a larger and more prestigious gallery now that the treaty had elevated humanity's standing in the Concord, but Lena declined every offer with the same polite smile. When Rio asked her why she wanted to keep the worst seats in the house, she leaned against the railing of the small balcony and looked out over the grand chamber, the vast crystal hall where 312 civilizations gathered to shape the future of the galaxy. And she said something that Rio would remember for the rest of his life. "The view from the back of the room is the best in the house. Rio, you can see everyone, and no one sees you coming." Below them, the grand chamber hummed with the ordinary business of the Concord, treaties being debated, trade disputes being settled, the endless mundane work of keeping a galaxy running. And somewhere in that hum, so quiet that only the humans could hear it, was the sound of everything changing. Because the galaxy had learned something in those 72 hours that it would not forget, not in 100 cycles, not in 1,000, not ever. Do not taunt the humans. Not because they are the strongest, because they are not. Not because they are the oldest, because they are the youngest of all. Not because they have the most ships or the most weapons or the most territory, because by every measure they are small. But because when you tell a human that something is impossible, they take it as a personal challenge. And they have 8 billion minds, 8 billion hearts, and 8 billion reasons to prove you wrong. And they will not stop, they will not rest, and they will not give up until the impossible is done, and the people who doubted them are left standing in the ruins of their certainty wondering how it happened. That is what the Drailith learned. That is what the galaxy learned. And that is why, from that day forward, when a human delegation entered the grand chamber of the galactic Concord, even from the smallest balcony at the very back of the room, every species in the galaxy paid attention.